So this is lesson 3 in the Android learning path. In this lesson, we're going to discuss Android activities and layouts. So in the Android operating system, generally when you see something on the screen or a new screen loads, that is going to be an Android activity. So in almost all cases, each time you want to load a new screen, you'll be loading a new Android activity. So I've got our sample application running. This is not the application we built in the Buzztouch control panel. This is the application we built just from scratch using the new Android application option. And we didn't modify anything. And I want to show you what's happening here. I'm going to leave that running, and I'm going to make Eclipse a little bit smaller here. And I'll move it to the side so that we can see two things at once. So we have our application running in the emulator on the left, and we have Eclipse running on the right. So when we launched this application, without doing anything, automatically it brought us to this Android screen. Now this is called an activity. So because it's the first screen, I like to call it the home screen. But we have to ask ourselves as developers, how did Android know that we wanted this activity to display when the Android application launched? And so in our manifest file, we have this group of things inside the application tags, or this application node. So I'm going to spread this out a little bit, and I'm going to show you here that inside this application tag here and here, in between these two, we have, in this case, one activity. So this activity starts here and ends here. We could have additional activities. In fact, in almost all cases, additional activities will always exist in your application's manifest, because most applications have lots of activities. My next activity, for example. So we could have lots and lots of activities in our list, in the manifest. And that's important to understand, because we can't launch a new activity or display a new activity unless it's listed in the manifest. So we might have my second activity, my third activity, and so forth. Now these will probably be things, be named things like About Us, or Map to Store, or what else? Upload, or update profile. Whatever the purpose of the screen is, that's generally what the activity name is. So I'm going to get rid of these again. I got off on a little bit of a tangent. And we're going to go back to this idea that our application only has one activity. And the activity rules associated with this activity tell the Android operating system that this is the main activity. So because this activity, named Monterey Harbor activity, is the main activity, it is the one that displayed when the application launched. So only one of the activities in your project will be the main activity. In this case, it's called Monterey Harbor. So we can assume as developers that this activity is where we want the application to start. If it isn't where we wanted it to start, of course, we could change this. So that's what we're going to do, is we're going to change our application a little bit and add an additional activity and then start it there, just to demonstrate it. So for every activity, for every screen that your application has, you're always going to have at least 3 components. You're going to have in your source code, you're going to have the actual Java class file for this activity. And you'll notice this name matches precisely this name here. In the manifest you start it with a dot, but Monterey Harbor activity.java is the name of the activity in our manifest. So that's the first thing we'll have, is a Java source code file. The second thing that we'll have for activities that we're going to display on the screen is we'll have a layout file. Now this layout file here is what controls what the activity looks like. So I'm going to open up this layout file, and the layout file is an XML file, and it looks a little bit cryptic because for new folks, people new to the Android development world, it is a little bit confusing, but it does get easier. So this main.xml layout file is associated with this Monterey Harbor Java file. And I know that because I looked at the Java file and I can see this line right here where it says set content view r.layout.main. that's telling me that when this activity launches, it's going to find a file called main in the layout folder, and it's going to apply it to the screen with the set content view. So, in order to create a new activity in Android, we need three things. We need the Java file that runs all the code for the activity. We need the layout file that describes how the activity is displayed on the screen, and it'll have lots of widgets and elements inside the layout, and we'll get to that in a minute. And then we also have to make sure that our activity exists in the Android manifest.xml file. So let's modify our application a little bit, kind of in a step-by-step fashion. So we know that the Monterey Harbor activity.java file is the first activity that the first piece of code that launches when our application starts to run. And we know that right here it says set content view to our main.xml layout file. So let's make a new layout file and change this to use a different layout. So I'm going to go to the layout folder, and I'm going to create a new file, and I'll just choose a type of file that I want to work with, and so I'll just choose an Android XML file because I know that I want to make a layout file, and I will call this home screen layout.xml, and it's telling me right away, and I did this on purpose, that file-based resource names must contain only lowercase letters, numbers, or the underscore. So that's kind of frustrating sometimes, but it is some of the rules. So that's why you'll see some file names. Normally I like to do my file names with in camel case, where the first letter of each word is capitalized. That's kind of a traditional programming method. But in Android you can't always do that, so you have to follow the rules. But I'll just create a new XML file called homescreenlayout.xml, and we'll do it all in lowercase because that's what Android insists. And I'll say finish. So now I have an Android layout file called homescreenlayout.xml. I'm going to make this a little bit bigger so we can see. And you can see that in our previous layout file, main.xml, we were looking at the raw XML. We were not looking at this graphical layout tab. And when we created our new XML file, it defaulted the view to the graphical layout tab, which is fine, but we can also look at the plain XML. So let's add a few widgets to the screen in this layout file. So our integrated development environment, Eclipse, and because we've installed the SDK, we can choose all kinds of widgets to add to this screen. So let's add a text box to the screen. And then under that, maybe we want to add a text area to the screen. So we'll add 2 items. Now, if we were to look at the XML, you'll see that it added those 2 elements for us automatically in the XML, which is kind of nice. But let's go back to the graphical layout and let's add some text here right inside this box. So we can say that you can see that Eclipse and the Android SDK gave this an ID of text1 and an ID of text2. But let's set the actual text of this top box. Android text equals my top box. So I'm just changing that one part of this layout file so that you can see how this works. And you can see over here that the graphical layout reflects our changes. But let's save this. And let's go back to our Monterey Harbor activity.java file. And instead of loading the main XML file, let's load the home screen layout.xml file. And all we did is we created a new layout, and then we're going to apply it to this activity. And I see that I have an error there, which is interesting. It's because it doesn't want the XML at the end. So let's take that out of there. And then let's relaunch our application and see what happens. So when I relaunch this application in the simulator, what I expect it to do is exactly the same thing as before, load this activity, but we change this activity a little bit to use this layout instead of the main.xml layout. And on a side note here, what I usually do sometimes as I explore is I do things like this. This is what it looked like before. I just comment this out and then add a line below it. So we can create and explore and experiment with these different layout files really quickly. And then we can tell our activity class, our Java class, to use that particular layout, which is kind of nice. So that was pretty fast. But let's take it a step further and let's create a new activity, altogether new activity, add it to our manifest, and then start our application there. So in order to do that, remember we need a couple of things. We need a Java file and we need a layout file, unless we want to use a layout file that we've already created, which is what we're going to do in this case. So I'm going to go up to my source code and I'm going to say new, and I'm going to choose a class as the new file type, a new class. So this is where I want to save it, and this is the package. And I'm going to call this my home screen.java. And once again, it's not going to let us, my home screen, it's not going to let us add Java. I always forget some of the syntax here. And then it's going to ask for a superclass. I'm going to change this superclass, which is beyond the scope of this lesson, but I'm going to change this to an Android activity so that it writes some code for us automatically. And I'm going to say finish. So what we've done here is we've created a new empty class that extends the Android activity, and that's the code it wrote automatically for us. If we look at our other class, you see here inside of this initial method that's called the constructor, we have a method here called onCreate. I'm going to copy this and I'm going to paste it in our new class that we created, and we're going to launch this activity as the home activity and not this activity. So when this activity launches, we're going to apply our layout that we already created. So in order to do that, we need to do two things. We need to go to our manifest, and the first thing we need to do is we need to make sure that the new activity that we just created exists in our manifest. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new activity node, activity, and I'm going to name it. And I need to name it dot and then the name of the class file, my home screen. I'm going to add a few other little flags here just to be consistent with the way I normally do it. And what I'll do here, and you can kind of ignore some of these details, and you can look through a lot of the other projects and see what this means, but I'm just going to add that. And now we have two activities in our manifest. But we haven't told Android to change the home activity. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this intent filter, I'm going to cut it out of there, and I'm going to apply it to this activity. And then I'm going to move this first activity below the activity we just created. And I do it that way just out of tradition. I like the first activity in my list, the activity that's going to serve as our home screen. I like it to be on the top of my list of activities in the manifest. It just makes it a lot easier. So I'm going to save that, and then we're going to launch our application. And what you're going to find here, what we expect it to do, is to launch my home screen as the default activity and not the Monterey Harbor screen. So how do we know that this is happening? How do we know which screen is running? Well, one trick is to change the title inside the manifest. See where it says label? What we can do is we can change this label to my first screen. And then we could relaunch it just to make sure that the activity we expect to be loading is actually loading. And you'll see that label show up in the title bar in the Android application on the device. So sure enough, this is now our home screen. So let's review for a second. We created a new Java file. We did not create an XML file because we're using an existing layout, an XML layout file. And then we added that activity to our manifest. So when you download your source code from when you're working with a Buzztouch project, you'll see lots and lots and lots of different Android activities listed in your Android manifest. And this is because the activities that are going to be used have to be listed in advance in the manifest. So that is how you create new activities in a very, very simple way. So the next thing we're going to do is let's load an activity after the home activity. So all we did is created a new activity and then set it as the home screen, but how do I launch another activity from this activity, which happens all the time? Imagine scrolling through a list and then tapping a menu item. We would certainly want to load a new screen when that menu item was tapped. So let's modify our home screen layout and let's get rid of our text boxes. We can just take them out of our XML and let's add a button to this screen. That way we can tap the button and load an additional activity. So let's add a button to the screen, and you can see that Android set this XML up for us for our button. And in the text value here I'll put load next screen. And I'm going to close this my home screen Java file for just a sec. Actually, you know what? I'll leave that open. That's not important. I'm going to go back to our manifest and I'm going to close this because we're not going to manipulate the manifest anymore. We have two activities and two layouts. So my home screen Java file is going to load the home screen layout, and in that layout we have a button. So what we need to do is we need to figure out a way to tell Android using some code to launch a new activity when the button is clicked. So this does get a little complicated, but this exercise is worth going through because I want you to see what developers do when they write code to launch new screens. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to figure out a way to get what we call a reference to this button. So how do we get a reference to this button? So in Java, we're going to declare a variable for the button, and then we're going to reference that button with a couple of source code lines here so that we can then tell Android what to do when that button is tapped. So when we want to get references to UI components or widgets, we need to do a few different things to declare the variable and make that connection or get that pointer. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to tell Java and Eclipse, or excuse me, Java and Android what kind of a button we're dealing with here. So, or what kind of a widget we're trying to connect. So the type of object, and then we want to name, the object. So object name, and then we want to find it in the view. So what we'll do here is we'll say button, my button equals, and we're going to cast this as a button. That's a complicated word that you can ignore right now. Find view by ID, and then we're gonna tell with Java here, we're gonna tell it what view to find or what widget to find by its ID. So this one here is called button 1. So we're gonna find view by ID, which is r.id.button1. I almost wrote buzz there. So far so good, but we've got some red here. Why do we have some red in our code? You might see this when you try to begin exploring and writing your own code, and I'm just going to hover over it to show you what's going on. Using Java, we told this class file here for our activity that we want to start working with this button. But the error says button cannot be resolved to a type. And that's because we haven't imported, you see the import statements up here? We haven't imported the necessary Android and Java code to start using buttons. So we need to import the button class, or import the button header file. So that's just a shortcut way to do that. We could have done this in advance and then written this code and we wouldn't got the error. But I wanted to show you that you can't just start using widgets unless your class file understands that you're going to use them. So here's a pointer to our button. At this point, we could do lots of different things with this button. For example, we could say my button set text, and we could do button text, right? And so we could change what the text was. The layout in the XML, we set the text to load next screen, but we could override that with source code. But really what we want to do is we want to tell Android to load a new screen when that button is clicked. So we need to do what's called setting an on-click listener. So we'll say my button dot set on click listener, and we're going to create a new on click listener, and what we're going to do here is write some code that fires when the button is clicked. But once again, we get a little red message here because we haven't imported the necessary code for in this class file for on-click listeners. So I'm going to finish writing this code, and then I'm going to show you how to import that stuff. So on-click view, I'm doing this from memory. It's kind of hard sometimes. We're going to do this, and what's going to end up happening is we're going to have to import some of this stuff so that we can get rid of some of these messages. So let's get rid of this. Just using the shortcuts here. There we go. So what's happening here is we just got some syntax issues, and that's not what this lesson is about, is syntax. And none of us, no developers remember all the syntax. I'm just trying to get through it to show you how to load a screen on a button click. But anyway, on line 18 we got a reference to our button in our XML file. And then on line 19 we said, hey, my button, set up an on-click listener so that when it's clicked we can load up a new screen. So button was clicked is going to go right there. So what we want to do when that button is clicked is we want to launch a new activity. To start that new activity, we need to do something called create an intent. So let's create an intent, and we'll call this next intent. And you're going to see some red stuff while we work through this syntax. Equals new intent. And you can, in fact, just ignore the syntax right now because it's not real important how this is working. I just want to show you how we're going to create the next activity, which is Monterey Harbor activity.class. So what we've done here is we've created a new intent, and we named the class file in this method call that we want to load next. So it's our Monterey Harbor activity class. And then we're just simply going to tell Android this class that we're in, my screen, or my home screen is the name of this class, .start activity, and then we're going to send it next intent. So what's going to happen is Android, if I get my syntax right here, I'm missing a T, intent. So Android is going to start the next intent, the next activity, and pass along some information here and bring it to the forefront. And then the activity that's running that holds the button is going to move to the background. So let's make sure that our Monterey Harbor activity, the one that we're going to load on the button click, loads our main layout file so that we know that it looks a little bit different. And let's review this and make sure we understand what we're doing. We got a reference to the button. We set a click listener, and we're going to load a new intent when that button is clicked. So let's go ahead and run this and see what happens. So when our home screen launches now, we took away the text fields, so we're only going to have one widget on the screen, which is our button. And that button is going to say load next screen on it because we set that in the layout, load next screen. And when we tap on that button, we're going to get the Monterey Harbor activity, and it's going to transition in just like that. And then we can use Android's built-in back method to transition back. So we're loading an activity and we're unloading an activity. We're loading an activity and we're unloading an activity. And because that activity was declared in our Android manifest, it loads up without any errors and without any problem. So really, when you're working with Android applications, you're going to see lots and lots of code. They're going to load and unload activities based on events. So in this case it was a button click, but it might be a menu item tap, or an item on a map, a bubble on a map might get tapped, or a song ends, or something like that. So to summarize, in order to create a new activity, in order to use a new activity in our projects, we have to declare that activity in the manifest. We need to make the Java file for it, and then in that Java file we need to tell it what layout file to use. In most cases, the layout file is something that we have to create. So hopefully you learned a little bit, and until next time, happy app building.